Thank you very much, Roger. Thanks for having me here. If you guys are anything like me, you've spent the last hour since Jim Fishkin's talk absolutely sweating at the prospect of automated moderators. I find that terrifying. But as they have not been, where is he? He's over here. Have they finished work on that? So as those still don't exist, I'm up here for now, and for the next hour and a half. I'm here to introduce our two guests. On my left here is Linda Zerilli, who is the Charles Merriam Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago, and whose most recent book is A Democratic Theory of Judgment. And also is Walter Russel Mead, who is a professor here, the James Clark Chase Professor of Foreign Affairs and Humanities, and the editor-at-large of The American Interest. And certainly for a lot of students, including my own students in the past, the author of Special Providence, a fantastic introductory text on American foreign policy. And they're here to talk about Jacksonian and Arendtian critiques of liberal democracy. I don't remember that we ever agreed who would go first. Would you like to go first?
Okay, hi, thank you. I said my thanks earlier to everyone who's involved in putting together this conference. It's really just been a pleasure to be here and very educational for me too, because normally I really am around a group of people like myself, not only with very similar political opinions, but simply academics. So, the raison d'etre of politics is freedom. Freedom is the right to be a participator in politics, in government, or it is nothing. These short sentences capture what I take to be the key to Arendt's political thinking. I'm going to employ them today as a departure point for reflecting on our current political predicament. In a political climate characterized by daily scandals generated by presidential tweets, a climate in which there is continual hand-wringing over citizen lives lived in an echo chamber, a post-truth climate in which a pervasive sense of threat and of threatening others, think immigrants, far exceeds any credible empirical evidence, and actual threats to citizen well-being, think climate change, are dismissed as fake news. A climate in which Americans have more trust in the military and small business, but hardly any in Congress. The list goes on. It can seem strange in this climate to talk about freedom, unless, of course, one is talking about the constitutionally based guarantee of civil rights, such as the right to freedom of assembly, to free speech, to religious liberty. The freedoms we associate with a specific form of democracy, liberal democracy. Here, politics is a means to secure freedom. But for Arendt, the activity of politics itself is freedom. We are free when we act, not before, not after. Freedom is not something we possess by means of constitutionally based rights. According to her, it is a fateful error to confuse constitutionally based civil rights with the constitution of political freedom. Fateful because such confusion can lead us to misrecognize the origins of constitutionally guaranteed rights in the actions of a law-giving sovereign, rather than in the practices of citizen action in concert in political freedom. And fateful because it entangles us in the political logic of sovereignty, from which the American Revolution, in Arendt's view, represents a decisive break. Now, there are several registers or dimensions to Arendt's critique of sovereignty, all of which are relevant to the current crisis of liberal democracy. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm only going to focus on what is called organ sovereignty. That is, the idea that somewhere in any political body there must be an ultimate authority that has the last word. That is to say, one institutional organ can trump all the others in the polity. This is, of course, the problem animating the current battles between the President and the Congress, the President and the courts, the President and the free press, etc. It is the problem that is at the heart of federalism and the system of checks and balances that characterizes the American political system. But Arendt's critique of sovereignty, I want to argue, goes beyond conventional understandings of the liberal constitutional order and the idea of, quote, limited government. And it goes beyond these because its inspiring principle is not negative freedom in the sense of constitutionally guaranteed rights, but political freedom in the sense of being a participator in government. Those of you who are familiar with Arendt's work will know that she celebrated the American Revolution as unique in generating a space of public freedom that was not reducible to constitutionally based civil rights. Thanks to historical circumstances and a variety of contingent factors, a federal system of institutions was created around local practices of self-government. She also celebrated Jefferson's unrealized idea of a ward system, and she was equally taken with the phenomenon of revolutionary councils, from the Paris Commune of 1871 to the Russian Soviets of 1917 to the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. Arguably, she would have celebrated the councils of the Spanish Indignados or the Occupy movement in 2011, those of the Arab Spring in 2011 or Gezi Park in 2013, and yes, Black Lives Matter and the Women's March. Arendt's praise for the ward system, the councils, and the Soviets is commonly read as of a piece with her celebration of action and the space of appearance, in which action and thus genuine politics could be momentarily experienced by citizens as part of what she called the lost treasure of political freedom, only to give way to the deadening forces of representative democracy and the modern state. As my student Nicholas Pletzer has argued, however, this reading is not wrong, but it misses a vital aspect of Arendt's account, which is that the councils, just like the wards, were always also organs of order, to her as much as organs of action, as she says in On Revolution. As organs of action and order at once, they are irreducible to the space of appearance, which would not survive the actuality of the moment that it is brought into being. They are forms of power in Arendt's idiosyncratic sense of the word, which has nothing to do with sovereignty, power over others, but is what comes about when people act together in concert. As power, this acting together in concert, however, has a kind of stability or durability that action lacks. That is to say, wards, councils, Soviets, etc., are organizational forms that have not yielded action to order. They are not episodic in the way that spaces of appearance are, but inaugurate a different kind of state of being in common that we have yet to fully grasp. The main point is that she thinks of the councils as being wholly alien to the principle of sovereignty and as proliferating sites of power, in her sense of the word, that can counteract attempts at achieving sovereignty in any one sphere of government. Now, how does Arendt's account of these alternative sites of power and critique of sovereignty help us to think through the impasses of contemporary liberal representative democracy? Well, one crucial way she does so is by calling our attention to how contemporary struggles within the Democratic Party might be in danger of becoming caught in the logic of sovereignty. It is all too easy to associate this logic with the DNC and its failed candidate, Hillary Clinton. The simple fact is that the Sanders campaign, Our Revolution, which is challenging the fundamental configuration of the Democratic Party, for which I am in favor, also stands in danger of losing track of the lost treasure of political freedom that Arendt saw as being resurrected in the councils. When the focus is almost exclusively one on achieving certain social goods, as good as these are, free tuition, Medicare for all, etc., we risk losing sight of another source of anger and frustration which has led to the momentous shifts that characterize U.S. contemporary politics. This is not just frustration over a government that is unresponsive to citizen needs and demands. The decline of the welfare state, the erosion of the middle class, the growth of a permanent underclass, and the impoverished homeless. This is also a problem of what happens when all we are as citizens are beings who can be, quote, represented. And then the issue becomes represented well or represented poorly. But this has nothing to do with political freedom in Arendt's view. All too often, critical analyses of our contemporary political malaise focus on what government, and in particular the Democratic Party, has or has not delivered in the form of goods, be they jobs, healthcare, housing, defense, etc. These are crucially important to how citizens view their government, no doubt. But it seems hard to imagine that the general loss of faith in government and the pervasive disdain for politics as the very lowest of all activities will be assuaged by a better delivery system of goods. The overwhelming sense that ordinary citizens have no say includes but goes way beyond these goods and their delivery. Likewise, the current debate over gerrymandering, which has made its way to the Supreme Court in the Wisconsin case of Gill versus Whitford, only begins to scrape the surface of our deep democratic deficit. The claim that gerrymandered districts essentially deprive citizens of their constitutional right to vote for their electors, to be represented by candidates of their choosing, is, of course, right. But it is also symptomatic. Will non-gerrymandered or less computer-generated gerrymandered districts really address the problem that Arendt diagnosed? I guess, like Uday Mehta this morning, I am very suspicious of arguments to, quote, save liberal democracy. For these fail, or when these, let's put it that way, when these fail to acknowledge the ways in which our current political crisis is symptomatic of certain limitations in our historical practice of liberal democracy. So in other words, I'm not talking about some abstraction, liberal democracy. I'm talking about the way in which liberal democracy has actually been enacted and practiced, let's say right now in this country. And with all due respect to Mika, who spoke yesterday brilliantly, I don't think that pursuing sovereignty should be the goal of a political movement that takes seriously the importance of political freedom, as Arendt understood it. Now, does this mean that we're condemned to a purely negative oppositional politics, as Martin Gurry suggested yesterday? Well, I think not. Black Lives Matter, feminism, radical environmentalism, and yes, even Occupy Wall Street are not or were not devoid of demands or visions of what would constitute a more just society. They are affirmative. They are not just negative. I really think that this is a false critique. The fact that they don't want to put in familiar sovereign forms of leadership leads us to think that they don't have any demands or a vision of what would be better does not resonate with my own reading of these groups and to some extent participation in these groups. Okay, well, yeah. So I have a lot of other points to make, but I'm not going to go into all of those now. I think I want to say one last thing, which is what disturbs me in the discussion of, saving liberal democracy from whom? From the people, and this idea of populism, which kind of keeps creeping up here in various ways as if the people, and I thank James Fishkin for his wonderful talk this morning, really cautioning us on the capacity of ordinary people to rationally deliberate about what is best in their lives and how crucially important it is to hold on to this idea. Because let's face it, right now, I too am very suspicious of the people, and it's easy to be pulled into thinking about them as, well, the ones who at least voted for the candidate I did not vote for, as the deplorables. But that is false. In other words, we cannot allow ourselves to be pulled into exactly that logic. And this really is my one last point in reference to Die Alternative für Deutschland, which we heard about this morning. It is simply not true that that is populism or that is the People's Party. That is a party that was founded by a group of elites, conservative elites, number one. Number two, it is a party that has articulated the legitimate grievances that people have, just like Donald Trump has articulated politically the legitimate grievances that people have in such a way as to completely obfuscate the real sources of those grievances. And that's really what we need to be focusing on. In other words, political parties articulate people's grievances. They can articulate them better or they can articulate them worse. But it's not as if these parties are just the voice of the people. Sorry, it's rather emotional.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Zerilli and Professor Mead.
All right. I'm not doing this to check my email. I'm just going to do it so I have some idea how long I'm talking. Because it feels to me like I could talk for hours and you would just, be enjoying it. But all right. I had an empirical test. How long can I talk before they leave? I had a very unusual and strange experience earlier this year. It started when I got a text on my phone one day from someone who said they were Steve Bannon and that they would like to talk with me. So I, thinking, I call back and it actually was Steve Bannon. And we had a couple of conversations. This was in the week, the first talk was in the week before he left the White House, and the second talk was a couple of weeks after. And what I found out was, among many other things, a very interesting man to talk to, but one thing that I found out was that, unfortunately, there is a link between a book that I wrote and something that is in the President's office, which is to say that the portrait of Andrew Jackson that Donald Trump had installed in the Oval Office is there because Steve Bannon had read this book, Special Providence, which talks about Andrew Jackson and Jacksonian populism, and thought that was exactly the model for President Trump, and You may have read that President Trump went down to the Hermitage, Andrew Jackson's home in Tennessee, and paid a kind of a visit to the grave and then installed this portrait. So I now have visions that when I'm dead, on my tombstone, it will be the intellectual architect of the Trump administration. But it was an interesting confirmation that this idea of Jacksonian populism, which is something that I've been thinking about and writing about for some time, really does register with people who are seen as advocates of this strain in American life. So what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about what Jacksonian populism is, for those of you who aren't students either of Steve Bannon or of Walter Russell Mead, and then talk about its relationship with liberal democracy as we experience it. That is to say, in one sense, why are they so mad at the status quo in America? And I hope to open up a conversation rather than end it. This is a topic I'm still trying to explore myself. Well, how do we explain Jacksonians? Who are they? What was Andrew Jackson's political movement? He was a very interesting man. If you've never read a biography of Andrew Jackson, I would urge you to do it. John Meacham wrote one not long ago that's pretty good. There's some others out there. But among other things, he was from South Carolina, and during the American Revolution, he was a young boy, about 12 or 13. He was fighting with the guerrillas and was captured by British troops. And a British officer told him to shine his boots. Jackson, as a 13-year-old prisoner of war, refused, and the officer cut him across the face with his sword. And Jackson got many votes later in life because of the scar that he bore. As commander of U.S. forces in one of the wars against the Creek and Seminole Indians in what is now our state of Georgia, Jackson found that the terrorists, as we might say now, were being supplied with weapons of mass destruction, that is, rifles and bullets and other war instruments, by two British traders who were living in what is now the state of Florida, but was then still Spanish property. For Jackson, it was perfectly clear what to do. He sent U.S. forces across the international frontier into Spanish Florida. He arrested those two British merchants. He brought them back to U.S. soil, tried them before a military tribunal, and then hanged them. See, right there you see everything that the European Union doesn't like about the United States in that one incident. And that helped make Andrew Jackson so popular that his election to the presidency was just a matter of time. In foreign policy, Jacksonians stand for, they're not trying to change the world. They don't believe in, the U.S. is on a mission from God to convert the world to Christianity or to human rights or anything else. Their policy toward foreigners is live and let live until the foreigners attack the United States, at which time it's kill, kill, kill. That Jacksonians believe that war is something that if it's important enough to fight a war, you fight a war with everything you've got and you try to end it as quickly as possible. Otherwise, you don't mess with it. So on December 6, 1941, almost no one in the U.S. was interested, particularly in public opinion, in support of the idea of going into World War II. After the Japanese sneak attack at Pearl Harbor, Jacksonians not only supported the war, they were so angry that President Truman felt it would be political ruin for him not to use nuclear weapons against Japan. And that if you look at the last 5 months of World War II, American forces killed roughly 900,000 to 1 million Japanese civilians in air raids at that time. In one night, bombing of Tokyo in March 1945, American forces killed somewhere between 80 and 100,000 Japanese civilians in Tokyo, dropping incendiary bombs in neighborhoods where the houses were built of paper, which was the Japanese practice at the time. That's the total killed in those 5 months, and I'm not including Hiroshima and Nagasaki in this total, was double the number of all U.S. combat deaths in all of our foreign wars from the Revolution to the present day. And that one night in Japan in Tokyo saw more civilian deaths than the total number of U.S. military deaths in the Korean, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan wars combined. And so this is, this is a way of war. You could see it even in our own Civil War, where Sherman's march to the sea was very much the deliberate use of essentially terror against a civilian population. That, teach these people, he said, don't know what war is, what it means. We must teach them what it means to rebel against the United States. And he did. In the same way, during World War II, some of Franklin Roosevelt's advisors suggested to him that it was a mistake to call for an unconditional surrender of Germany, because this would help Nazi propaganda persuade the Germans to keep the war going, to the last minute. And that, offering peace might be a way to divide the Germans. What Roosevelt said was, listen, the reason we're having this war is that in World War I, the Germans never really learned what war was. When World War I ended, German troops were still in France. They had never experienced the horrors of war. This one will not end until the Germans know what war means deep in their bones. Now, that's a very Jacksonian sentiment. And you'll notice that neither Germany nor Japan has been particularly warlike in the last 70 years, while before they were. So there is, we tend to kind of ignore this side. This is a difficult side of history and of the American national character to look at. And we have a tendency to think, what draws the world to us, what is making the world an American-style world, is the sheer beauty of our ideas and the glorious example of our conduct, etc. Possibly the example of our conduct is influential, but maybe not in such a glorious way. In any case, this idea, this Jacksonian sense of a country surrounded by hostiles, but that within it we're a folk and we're democratic and we're all equal inside, but outside we have enemies that we have to guard against. This turns out to be very foundational in the way American liberty and the American government develops. This is this sense of a free folk that doesn't have nobility and so on among itself, but those outside the folk are excluded from its protection. This had a lot to do with forging the American nation and forging American democracy. In American politics, Jackson is the one who introduced universal male suffrage, white male suffrage, into the American electorate. Before Jackson's political rise, there were actually American states where you needed more property to vote than in some British boroughs in parliamentary elections. All right? It was actually Andrew Jackson's revolution that broke the church establishments that were still in New England, where Massachusetts and Connecticut still had an established church that everyone had to pay taxes to support, whether they belonged to that church or not. So in many ways, the Jacksonian phenomenon in American politics is both a radically egalitarian politics among us, however the us is defined, but also very polarizing dynamic with those who are not us. You can see, I think, a lot of evidence of this today, that the outlaw is seen literally for the Jacksonians as often someone out of the law, out of the protection of the law. And the same way that Jacksonians wouldn't think that terrorists are particularly entitled to a bunch of rights and considerations, Jacksonian opinion, by and large in America, was not disturbed by Guantanamo. That Jacksonians would, in the same way, it's one of the reasons it's very hard to get a jury in the United States to convict a policeman, even in what looks to the lay person like pretty unambiguous circumstances. That the idea that the policeman or the soldier is the agent of the community in holding the chaos at bay, and therefore deserves the protection and support of that community. That is a deeply ingrained piece of American kind of folk culture. And it's one of the reasons that the jury system has been so slow to respond to issues that, say, Black Lives Matter and other groups are raising. So the Jacksonians are real and they're there. Steve Bannon, I think, was not wrong in that it was the Jacksonian vote that was primarily responsible for Donald Trump's presidency. And as I say, we can see them in two ways. We can see them as being very democratic, small d, but also standing very strongly, even in revolt, against many of the things that we think of as essential to liberal democracy. I don't have much time to sort of trace this out, but what I would say is that Jacksonians believe that legitimacy derives from the people, and by the people they don't simply mean an aggregation of individuals who live in a particular territory. They mean people who share a cultural heritage of some kind and some set of cultural and political commitments. Jacksonians don't think America is an idea or a nation built on ideas. They think it's a nation like other nations that is built on people. Over time, Jacksonians have grown, who used to be very much the sort of heart of any kind of resistance to desegregation, to immigration from non-Anglo or European cultures. Jacksonians have somewhat mellowed. You don't see the same kind of open racism you did when I was a child and segregation was still legal in much of the country. But Jacksonians have not lost the sense that there is a clear divide between people who are in and people who are out. And how that boundary is defined is subject to question, is subject to negotiation, it's subject to change over time. And we see American public opinion moving in many ways in a sort of away from some of the more narrow Jacksonian values of the past to something more open. But in the interest of making this a discussion rather than a really long lecture, I would just like to end with a conjecture, which may also be a bit of a provocation, and that is that there are two possible ways of dealing with Jacksonianism and Jacksonians. One is to simply hate them, repudiate them, and hope they go away. To some degree, I would say this was in the Obama years. In his best moments, I don't think this characterized President Obama. But when he talked about bitter clingers, people clinging to their guns and their Bibles, a lot of Jacksonians saw that as his equivalent of the basket of deplorables. And the problem, of course, is that there are a lot of Jacksonians out there, and they don't seem to show much sign of going away. So we can engage in a politics of repudiation, opposition, and struggle, or we can try to engage in some kind of politics of engagement, of exploring common ground, of developing ideas of citizenship, of trying to overcome cultural and political and social divides in order to understand people and maybe work together, maybe still disagree. I'm not sure that either of these alternatives is 100% satisfactory, but my guess is that if you want another 4 years of Trump after this, the best way to do that would be to probably keep looking for ways to alienate Jacksonians and irritate Jacksonians. And I'll just close with maybe my most provocative observation of all, which is that minority identity politics sooner or later leads to majority identity politics. And that is bad for everyone, majority and minority, but probably worse for minority. There's just something to be thinking about as we look at a very, very difficult political situation in our country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you, for those very, very thought-provoking talks. I imagine there's a lot of questions from the audience. I'm going to start with a few questions of my own, if that's okay. I'll start with the first talk. I really have two questions that pop into my mind. I was surprised by the way you ended the sentence that we as citizens are not simply, and I was running with it and thinking of all the possible nouns that were going to come at the end of that, and you said we're not simply represented. And I have to say that wasn't where I thought the sentence was going. What's so wrong with that? Why is that inadequate, and what more do we need? That's my first question for you. And my second question is the mic. Oh. Okay, now I hear myself. All right. Well, now I have to ask a smart question. So my first question, did everybody hear it? Oh. All right. I was asking what was so inadequate about us as citizens merely being represented. What more do we want? With all the other ways I thought that sentence was going, I understood the inadequacy if we're to be more than consumers, or more than service providers, or more than, that was my first question. My second question was, I really enjoyed the comments that you were making in defense of these popular actions, whether it was Occupy or feminism or Black Lives Matter, and you were saying how they do have affirmative demands, which I think is true, and I think it's important to emphasize that in light of the discussion we were having yesterday. But my question is, well, why do they even need that, actually? I mean, I understand as a political program we need affirmative demands, but what is so wrong with just going out in the street and saying, I'm upset? I don't have a political program yet. I don't have a solution for police brutality, but I just see something happening, and I want to at least say that this is intolerable to me. And the same for all these other issues. It's not, and this maybe I think ties into my earlier question about represented, because I do think that's inadequate as a political program. And I think there's a place where we're going to have to disagree with each other and have a real political debate, and that's where this notion of representation is actually important. But when it comes to just going out into the street and expressing dissatisfaction, what's wrong with that? My question for Professor Mead, you really bring up this opposition, particularly in the 19th century context, but also well into our own time. At least in America, although it might be true in other countries, this real tension between the democratizing forces and the liberalizing forces. How they're often very, very opposed to each other. Again, this is much clearer in the 19th century, perhaps, than it is in our own time. For example, with the expansion of white male suffrage. So I get the half of it, why the democratizing impulse has not been very liberalizing. In the sense of, you explained that very well, that's what the last half hour was. I'm confused why the the countervailing liberal impulse, the side of American politics that did give us things like women's suffrage, that did give us things like abolition. I want to say civil rights, although I think civil rights is an exception because I think civil rights actually in its heyday did mobilize a mass movement in a way that very few other liberal movements did. Why has the liberalizing reformist impulse in America so often been inimical to mass democratic politics? That's the part that was still a mystery to me at the end of your discussion. Those are my questions.
Thank you. Well, I'll start with your second question first. It's not that there's something wrong with going out in the street and protesting injustice without having an idea of exactly how to change it or what sorts of things you want to be changed. You just want to stop being beaten, all right? That's perfectly legitimate form of protest. But Arendt makes a very important distinction, I think, between what she calls liberation and political founding. So it's one thing to be liberated from oppression, to liberate yourself from oppression, and it's another thing to found something new. In other words, to create new forms of being in common with other people. That's just a different, related but different project, and we shouldn't confuse the act of liberation, throwing off oppression, with this founding of new forms of being in common. So that's, I guess, what I would say. And I do think that these groups are trying to do that, you know? I mean, there are efforts there to do that. They do have very viable, practical, in many cases, ideas about how we can change things right now. Secondly, to the question of representation, I mean, I think it's just an issue of, you know, if you look at, once again, through Arendt, she was very critical of representative democracy, which can make it sound like, well, that's all very nice if maybe you live in Switzerland, but not even there, you know, I mean, what are you now going to have this direct democracy or something like that? It's not a matter of giving up a system of representative democracy as such. It's the fact that that is all we have, is to be a citizen is to be represented, not well represented, and then what we think is, oh, so what we really need is to be represented better, more accurately. In other words, our representatives should speak more directly to what it is we really want as citizens, the reasons we elected them in the first place. And all I'm saying is, yes, they should do that, but that's not enough. That's not why people are so disaffected with politics in this country. I don't believe that. I don't believe that it really is just a matter of delivering the goods better. I think it is a matter of having a sense that you really don't have a voice. You have no real say. It's the sense of just, yeah, you get the goods, you don't get the goods, but there isn't a sense of actually being part of the actual delivery of the goods, if you like, or part of the conversation about what it is we really want. So it's a different problem of politics.
Just to respond a little bit to that, which I found a very interesting intervention, it's always struck me that there is something intrinsically problematic with even the idea of democracy, in the sense that if you imagine a perfect global democracy in which each of the 7 or 8 billion or whatever it is now people have an equal say in how the world government works, what that essentially means is that all of us have no say, and that what each of us confronts is a massive force that is simply unresponsive to us. So that, you know, in a democracy even of 310 million, or wherever the U.S. is now, we start to see that problem. And that the entire, you know, the population of the 13 colonies at the time of the first census was less than the population of Los Angeles County today. So a system that, you know, those 3 million people or whatever were divided with, you know, maybe 15,000 to a member of the House of Representatives is just a completely different thing from what we have. And so representative forms may be able to disguise that to some degree, but they can't hide it. So somehow one's political autonomy, I think, I would agree with you, can't just be swept up into sort of representative institutions as outsourcing your democratic vocation in life. But to get to the question you asked me, you know, I think you have to look at American life and this struggle, this continuous struggle we have between a kind of a civilizing, disciplining, uplifting vocation, and then just wanting to break all the rules and run off vocation. This runs really all through our history, and we still see it today. In some ways, I looked at the last election. Hillary Clinton reminded me a bit of the Widow Douglas and Aunt Polly and Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn. You know, these sort of very, very genteel ladies out there imposing order, particularly on the unruly young males of the community. But in general, you know, just trying to, as the Widow Douglas says, civilize Huck. Then Donald Trump sort of reminded me of Huck Finn's father, who's this kind of drunken layabout rolling around in the mud with the pigs and complaining about how the federal government makes you do this, the federal government makes you do that. And, you know, I think those, in a sense, are both caricatures of elements that are very real in American society. Arguably, we may need them both to kind of balance each other. But there is a New England ideal, which I think the progressive movement to some degree embodies. And if you think about the early New England colonies, the idea was, first of all, only the godly could vote. So you had to be a member of one of the official churches, and you would only be elected to your membership in that church if the others thought your standards, the life of your standards, were good enough. And then the government should be very, very powerful to enforce God's law or the right way on the community. And so there has always been in American progressivism a sense of compulsion. And very much the turn of the 20th century, we think now of women's suffrage as almost the defining movement. Actually, prohibition was probably the most important, and it was there to control the behavior of the unruly lower classes, the immigrant masses, and all of this. It was upper middle class reformers who saw that we really needed to lick those lower orders into shape. And again, I think we still see this today, that on the one hand, the sort of professional middle class, which is probably where most of us either are or will soon be when we graduate and pay off at least some of our student loans, sees its job as, on the one hand, repressing the excessive greed of the rich, who, if left to themselves, would wreck America through their naked pursuit of self-interest, but then also disciplining and uplifting the rest of society, which, if left to itself, would run amok and do all kinds of disgusting and despicable things, basket of deplorables that they are. And so this is this kind of uneasy vocation. That vocation is being called into question, both because it's less easy to regulate the economy when you have a global economy, and it's also when the basket of deplorables, have a lot more education than they used to and are a lot less deferential to authority. So Trumpism in some ways does represent a kind of a rebellion of the lower middle class against the upper middle class. People don't want to be told how to raise their children. They're not interested in the counsel of experts in various things. Anything from climate to nutrition You know, they're just not interested in what the experts say. There's a lack of trust. And there's an objection to the social power that gives certain types of people a lot more say. So I think typically it is a little bit of Huck Finn's father and the widow Douglas. Both sides go too far into their kind of, their cultural aspirations. And I'll stop with this. The election of 2016, odd as the result may seem, was in many, many ways a classic American election in a pattern that does go back really even to the early 19th century. And that is, New England has one candidate who is, generally speaking, a kind of a candidate of order and a candidate of a liberal candidate. And the South has another candidate who's a candidate of populism and some other things, good and bad. The Middle West typically would cast the deciding vote between the New England candidate and the Southern candidate. That's pretty much what happened in 2016. Hillary Clinton was the candidate of New England, Donald Trump was the candidate of the South, and in Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, by a very thin margin, the voters decided this time, we're sick and tired of the widow Douglas, it's time to give Huck Finn's pop a try.
Thank you for that. And we'll open it to questions. I'll just make one tiny quick comment. I'll make one tiny quick comment. I think it's interesting that the two examples you picked were nutrition and the environment, because I think that for an enormous part of the American public, the part of the American public in particular that has completely abandoned any kind of organized religion, those two things replace a kind of theology. There's something deeply religious about the way people talk in certain circles about climate change, about offsetting carbon. You purchase indulgences to undo your sins. And when you don't like somebody, the possibility, the option of profaning a holy symbol of that person is so satisfying. So satisfying. I don't think we have any sense of just how happy it makes some people to drive an SUV that pollutes, not because they don't think that it's not polluting, but precisely because they know that in this way they're essentially stomping on a holy mat of people that they're already predisposed to dislike. I think there's an enormous power to those things. So I thought it was notable that you picked both of the most theologically infused pieties that we have. Let's open the floor to questions. Just raise your hand and then hopefully microphones will come to you. There's a hand over here and hopefully there'll be a microphone in it in a second.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Shemezi. I attend Bard High School Early College in Newark. So, this is my question. I can't remember her name, but the first speaker, she touched on...
Linda. Linda.
Oh, Linda. You touched and spoke about freedom and freedom in politics, but I have asked this question millions in one time, and I'm going to still ask again until I get a concrete answer. What is freedom if politics can only accept certain people? What is freedom if I vote, but technically speaking, my vote does not really count? What is freedom if I am limited to do and ask what I want from politicians? So basically, what I'm trying to say is that what is freedom if, as a minority like myself, I am not granted it or given full rights to it? My next question is, what can the majority do to help the minority? Instead of the majority voicing their opinions through social media and whatnot, why are they not physically present in Black, Asian, Hispanic, etc. communities trying to help? Why is America not open and shying away? You ask for peace and change, yet you are shying away from it than embracing it.
Thank you for your question. I'll
You're
maybe
welcome.
try to answer the first one, and do you want to try to answer the second. I fully agree with your skepticism that you express in that question. You know, what is freedom if I don't find myself there, if I'm excluded from those spheres in which, you know, freedom is presumably being either enacted or taken or whatever. And that's, you know, that's a large part, I think, of what Hannah Arendt is trying to get at, that people, no one can represent your freedom for you. In other words, it is only you who can enact your own freedom through political action. So it's not, you're absolutely right to say that there are structures of power which keep people from being able to claim political freedom and to act in the ways that Arendt associates with political freedom, like the voluntary right of assembly. I mean, lots of, we have many examples of people trying to organize and being shut down by the police or shut down by the government or some other structure of power, by white nationalists or whatever. So, but I think the main point is that freedom is not something that can be guaranteed for you by someone else. Only you can claim your own freedom.
You know, the question of how do we, in a sense, bring people together in this country to work together on common issues and to understand each other better, I think that's a really good question, an important one. If there were one thing I could do, or suggest, to actually be, you need to, I think government doesn't do this very well because you're really talking about civil society and people in their own lives. And you have to look at institutions through which that can be organized. And I actually think that churches and other houses of worship are an interesting place. It would be great to see more, say, suburban churches forming partnerships with churches in the cities or in other areas where there are needs, and for people to get to know each other, work with each other, and then start to explore, so what do we do? Where do we go from here? Might be a way, but overcoming some of these personal gaps, I think, is really important for our health as a people.
Yes.
Just a brief question, and it interested me. We heard two different talks on populism, several today. But would you contrast the Jacksonian populism of America with the so-called Heimat populism of certain European countries, and which do you think is, let's say, more dangerous to the democratic process as liberals see it?
Well, I think you have to look at each country kind of on its own terms here. But I do think one thing we've been very lucky maybe in the U.S. is that from the beginning there's been a sense of, let's say, a bit of a separation between state and tribe, not just state and church. And this is partly because even back in the colonial days, if you think of, say 1760s America, okay, most of the people other than slaves and some free blacks were white, mostly from England and Scotland and Ireland, but from very different regions there with very different cultures. And the colonies, the 13 colonies fighting the English, each had their own identity, and in some cases people felt, well, I'm really a New Yorker more than I am an American. So that the idea of American patriotism or American nationality from the beginning included lots of variations. Just as because the American people from the beginning had so much religious diversity, true mostly within Protestantism, but religions that fought wars with each other in other parts of the world were living side by side in the U.S. And so you had, in a sense, this idea of denominations all under one roof. And there's a pluralism that's inherent in this concept. And over time, as you had greater immigration into the U.S., you begin to move to the Irish American. You can be both Irish and you can be American, Polish American, Italian American. There are lots of different ways of being American. And that, I think, has made American nationalism a little bit more flexible than some, say, French nationalism, to take one example, where you really kind of have to buy a whole package to become French. It's easier to become American than to become French because you have a lot more ways to do it.
Get the microphone over here, please.
Okay, so referring back to the question that Shemezi asked and what you answered to her, I believe you said that we have to claim our freedom. How do you think that we should claim our freedom? Like, do you think we have to join politics to claim our freedom?
Yes. Thank you for your question. Yes, I do. I mean, here I, and fortunately or unfortunately, and many other things, follow the thought of Hannah Arendt on politics, which is that, we tend to think about freedom as a kind of property of the subject, of the will, so free will, etc. And she really thought of freedom very differently. In other words, that freedom is, you are only free when you are acting with others. You are not free alone. In other words, withdrawal from the public does not make you free. Because on the view of freedom that she's criticizing, which I would criticize as well, there's a sense that, well, to be free, I really, Robinson Crusoe, for example, would be the freest person because there's nobody on his island. And the idea that others are only an obstacle to my freedom is one of the most dangerous myths, in her view, to a democracy. So, yes, acting politically, that's how you claim your freedom, not just withdrawing into an inner space.
Hello. I'm wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about the connection between sort of the Occupy Black Lives Matter movements and Arendt's cautions against social movements, as well as sort of, I see a connection towards people who support Donald Trump and some people who support Black Lives Matter as sort of having an anti-system view, and if you think that connects to the Jacksonian populism you're talking about.
I'm not sure how many people there are who support Donald Trump and Black Lives Matter. So I can't speak from direct observation, but I do think there is a sense in which both Black Lives Matter and the Trump movement are rejecting some of the kind of norms that the establishment would like to see political discourse limited within them. And both represent a deep disenchantment with the administrative bureaucratic state. That on the one, for people in Black Lives Matter, it may seem that the police and other institutions ostensibly there for justice and security have been perverted into something that's doing the opposite. And I think that's actually the way many Trump people look at the way the federal government more broadly is working, that it is entrenching privilege rather than trying to attack it. It is actually one of the interesting things is that sort of African American culture and Jacksonian culture in the U.S. have a lot of things in common and have deep historical roots. In some ways, both of them are children in different ways of the 19th century South. And so white Southerners tend, for example, to be very tribal in politics and vote in blocks. And a white Southerner who breaks ranks and votes for the other party is often considered kind of to have betrayed the community. There's a communalism in both the white and the black South that is not as present in the North. So there are interesting ways in which groups who feel marginalized by the center of American life do have certain things in common, but it's also been very difficult for these groups to form alliances. The power of culture and identity in American politics remains very strong.
Let me just take some more questions and then I'll...
A few more questions. We have about 15 minutes.
Is it on?
I'm intrigued by the last comment you made, Professor Mead, about all minority identity politics eventually becomes majority identity politics. Could you just elaborate on that a little bit?
All right. Well, let's do a thought experiment, and suppose we are a couple of 19-year-old white boys at a community college in Ohio. And we look around us and we see, hey, there's a black students group to talk about the issues of being black in America, and the university is supportive of that. There is the Latino group, there is a Native American group, there is a women's group. Let's form a group of young white men to talk about the special problems white men have and celebrate the heritage of white men and look for examples in history of great white men who can inspire us. All right? Now, these are not the children. We're talking about an Ohio community college. We're not talking about people who are from wealthy backgrounds. It's like supposedly the Trump voter in West Virginia who said, dang, I cashed in all my white privilege for a job in a coal mine. These are people who would not consider themselves as major beneficiaries of a system of privilege. The chances are at most universities today, the establishment would come down on them like a ton of bricks. And the sense, and even if they refrain from doing this because they sense what would happen, they're feeling othered. And they're feeling different, that a difference has been imposed. If you're imposing a difference on a majority, the reaction is probably not going to be good. And it was interesting in this last election, the fact that Donald Trump got 53% of the white women's vote, I think is actually rather telling. That if you look at how Martin Luther King and a number of other people have managed in American history to gain acceptance, it's out of appealing to universal rights and to American citizenship as something that we all establish, that we all enjoy and should all benefit from equally. So there may be, it seems to me, ways of trying to hook some of these movements into a more universal kind of politics. But it is a real danger that if white America starts thinking that these things are aimed at it, against it, a significant chunk of people will react in negative ways, and the consequences for our politics and our culture won't be good.
Can I actually respond to that? Because I have to respectfully disagree with you. I mean, we had majority white male politics before we ever had so-called identity politics. So I mean, I just don't see, I'm really getting irritated at this constant sort of, blaming of identity politics, which is just a specter. I don't even know what it is anymore. And although I have been accused of representing it in some way at times in my life, it's that, identity politics, first of all, what goes under the name of identity politics is a response to exclusion from majority white male identity politics that has ruled this country for a very long time. So, to the extent that you're now getting this kind of backlash, or whatever you want to call it, a resentment, ressentiment on the part of this majority identity politics, it's not coming, there's no causal relation here, is what I'm saying. And I do think that I would fully agree with you that political movements need to appeal to commonalities. I think that's enormously important. But I think that many groups that are accused of identity politics have appealed. I mean, for example, think of the farm workers, movement or something. I mean, Cesar Chavez has now been accused by people like Todd Gitlin of identity politics. Is that identity politics? I don't think so. I mean, so we need to really look at how identity politics is being used as a way of explaining what is now happening in our country. And in a sense, blaming, the very people who are victimized by what is happening now in our country. I think that's dangerous, and it's also historically incorrect.
Can I just ask a very quick question then? In the example that, in the example that you gave, if we're at an Ohio community college and a group of white males want to start a white male student group celebrating white male history and all the other things. I don't remember exactly how the example was constructed, so I hope I've been faithful to it. What should the university administration's reaction be, in a sense?
I would actually ask some people here in the audience to get in on this instead of just me giving answers. But did you have a question over there? That was
it goes to the crux, though, of the charge
what?
that you're...
I mean, I can answer that. Okay, I can answer that very simply, which is that it's not as if the representation of all identities is, quote, equal. You have your identity, I have my identity, they're all identities, and, well, we get to have a white male group. Well, it just happens to be the case that white male groups, I'm at the University of Chicago, I walk into rooms every day that are decorated with giant portraits of white men. And that's at the University of Chicago, So my point is that to treat these things as if, well, if you get to have your identity group, then we get to have our identity group, is really to completely obliterate the reality of discrimination in history in this country. I just, I can't accept that. I don't think we should accept it.
So you wouldn't let them do it?
It's not about whether let or not. It's a matter of what I am. Would you let them do it if you were the university administrator? No, see, I'm not going to go there.
Why not?
It's because
it's a simple question.
Well, it's not really a simple question, because I think that once again it becomes a thing of you're trying to set certain limits on what it is people can do. And what I am saying is we need to think critically about how people deploy their identities politically, that's not all the same, and everyone's deployment of their identity is the same. So for a group that has historically been advantaged to then claim that identity as something that it has the right to preserve, like all white male clubs? No. If you want a simple answer, I wouldn't allow them. There you go.
Okay.
Let's go to a few more questions. We have less than 10 minutes.
Roger, you better get up here soon.
We have less than 10 minutes. I want to go all the way to the back of the room. There's a hand up.
Would Hannah Arendt have allowed them?
I don't know.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm sorry to make you all uncomfortable by clapping, but that was my first point that I wanted to make, is to get back to this question of identity and politics. But I did have another, so I was in full support of the answer from Professor Zerilli. But my other question was going to be about this, this idea that the support for Trump is connected to a kind of, okay, Jacksonian populism, populist tradition, but also this idea of the sort of lower middle class rising up and against a kind of temperance movement coming out of New England or whatever, the New England tradition. The thing is, all the data shows that the median income of Trump voters was actually about $70,000, and that, as you yourself said, that 53% of white women voted for Trump. So to just explain Trumpism, I'm sure that you have a much more complicated reading of it, but what you presented today made it sound as though, you know, it's this tradition of this id in America that has nothing to do with, that it's all about income or socioeconomic position and not about race. And I was wondering if you had anything else to say on that to sort of complicate that situation, because to me that just doesn't ring true if we know that people of all incomes, and white Americans in particular, were voting for Trump. So thanks.
Yeah, well, again, it's not simply an income thing. You know, the car dealer is going to be richer than the university professor. The university professor is more likely to prefer New England good governance, and the car dealer may be more likely to prefer the American id. So it doesn't distribute in some even, may I say, bell-curved way along income lines. And obviously identity is very difficult too. That some people have said that actually if Clinton had received the same percentage of minority voters that Obama did, Clinton actually could have won the popular vote in some of those contested electoral states. So the issue of identity and voting has always been complicated in America and remains so. But I do think we can say that there's a group of people, some rich, some poor, mostly located in the upper middle class, who do strongly see the kind of New England ideal of an American Commonwealth as what this country really needs and what can make us great. And there's another group of Americans, some of whom are rather wealthy, some of whom are quite poor, who see that concept as a threat to their own freedom and self-understanding. And that's been true for a very long time, and I think it's still true now.
Okay, let's take one last question, and if I'm not mistaken, that part of the room has been underrepresented in this discussion. So way over there in the corner.
Hi. So what is my question? I guess I'm wondering about this idea of Trump voters or Jacksonians being disaffected or marginalized, and I guess I'm just wondering if either of you, both of you, sort of really substantiate that. Like, what does that mean? What are they marginalized from? What do they actually want? So if they're revolting against the elites, right? Did they want to go to Yale and end up going to New York and getting jobs in fashion, prestigious? Or, like, what do they actually want? What are they actually disaffected from, like, in real concrete terms?
It's a good question, and again, it's not so much whether I think they should be disaffected, but whether they think they should. So it's we're talking about something that's in their minds, may or may not be real. I think I wrote a piece that was in Foreign Affairs at the start of this year that I go into this more, but it would be things like the Second Amendment, the arms thing, a very long-term sense of even paranoia in American society is rooted in the belief of a lot of Jacksonians that the right to bear arms is the most important right of a free people. Because ultimately, they would say the American government was formed by a revolution. You think of the, the conquered militia fighting the British who were trying to destroy freedom. And so when they see the government trying to take their guns away, or at least Democrats talking as if that were something that at least some of them wanted to do, they interpret that through the lens of a government that is trying to stomp them down and oppress them. I'm sure a lot of people here saw the Hunger Games movies. That's probably the best picture of the way a lot of Jacksonians think America actually works. Okay? They see the people on CNN as being like those people from the Capitol, with the crazy hairstyles and the crazy ideas and the utterly selfish motivations, thinly disguised by sort of, oh, I love, fairness and the people, so that hypocrisy. But watch those films and imagine how you would feel if that's the way you actually thought that was the direction into which America was going. And I think you'll understand the intensity of the revolt and the disaffection that some people have.
See, I don't think that their grievances are just imagined. I take their grievances very seriously. People are getting killed in this economy. And the problem is that you have the political articulation of those grievances through the right and through the Republican Party in terms that obfuscate the actual causes of people's immiseration, okay? So, we need to take these people seriously. They have real grievances. The problem is that they think that the cause of their grievances are immigrants, African Americans, Latinos, etc. That's really where the problem lies. It's how they understand what's happening to them. It's not whether what's happening is or is not happening. It's happening. Okay, so
I'm sorry, so do you think that in the end it's a question of the factory jobs, right? Do they want their old life, quote unquote, of, a decent factory job, raising the family, being left alone?
Yeah, I would too. What's wrong with that,
yeah, no.
Right? So, okay.
The problem is we probably can't deliver it to them. And we don't actually know how to, just as in the Industrial Revolution, we didn't really know how to manage the new economy, the new financial system. So we're actually in a situation where I think grievances, both among minorities, among poor, among many people's grievances in this country are unlikely to be addressed in a way that they find satisfactory for an indefinite period of time. That we've had other periods like this in our history. We're coming out of a relatively smooth period in our history when, after World War II, we had a more consensual system. And while not everybody benefited equally, and the system was certainly not perfect, it was reasonably satisfactory to a lot of people, and we now look back on it with a lot of nostalgia.
Well, some people look back on it with a lot of nostalgia, and I just want to say that...
But we just talked about they want their old jobs in the factories back.
I agree with you that manufacturing jobs are not coming back. They're not, and that is the ideology that Trump is spewing to try to get them to believe that they can have the past again. They can't. But that doesn't mean that they can't be lifted out of poverty. That doesn't mean that they have to be defaulting on their mortgages. That doesn't mean et cetera, et cetera. And there are other ways, but that's not what's talked about. What's talked about is a whole nostalgic vision of what you once had, and then these people came and took it away from you. And so, once again, I come back to their grievances are real. They can be met. They can be met. They cannot be met in the terms that the Republican Party says they can be met, but to treat them as illusory is, you know, throw in the towel.
All right, thank you very much for that. Thank you very much to both of you, Professor Mead and Professor Zerilli, and thank you very much for the audience for the questions. Don't go anywhere. Our next discussion begins right now.
So we'll welcome up Wyatt Mason and Teju Cole. And we had to cut off a very interesting conversation. One of our panelists has to get out to the train or plane. So, but please welcome Wyatt Mason and Teju Cole.
Less Arendt than I expected.
If everyone could begin to take their seats as we move on to the next section of the program.